ठेकेदार चाहते हैं कि आपको लगे कि आप स्वतंत्र हो। सोचो, गिग वर्कर अगर स्वतंत्र है तो कैसी स्वतंत्रता है जो वो खुद ही महसूस नहीं कर पा रहा। ठेकेदार बोल रहा है आप स्वतंत्र हो। बेवकूफी की बात है ना, क्योंकि जेल में कोई जेलर रोज रात को चिल्लाता थोड़ी है कि आप जेल में हो। वो तो उन्हें पता है ना, वो तो उन्हें पता है, वो तो उन्हें पता है।
हमें हमारा सब चाहिए, हमें हमारा हक चाहिए, हमें रेटिंग नहीं हक चाहिए, हमें रेटिंग नहीं हक चाहिए। जान सूचना में जारी चल निकलो मेरे साथ या कुछ कर साथ मेरे, मैं हूँ साथ खड़ा। जान सूचना में जारी चल निकलो मेरे साथ या कुछ कर साथ मेरे, मैं हूँ साथ खड़ा। ये काम हमारा आम नहीं, ये बात हमारी आम नहीं, तुम कान खोल के सुन लो रे। इंसान है हम,
इंसान है हम, गुलाम नहीं। इंसान है हम, गुलाम नहीं। इंसान है हम, गुलाम नहीं।
कोई भी व्यक्ति जब काम के लिए निकलते हैं, जब नौकरी के लिए पहुंचते हैं कहीं, तो आपकी क्या अपेक्षा होती है कि नौकरी मतलब क्या क्या चीजें होती है?
बाकी इधर से कंपनी ने तय कर दिया, उसमें खुश हो आप कि और भी कुछ अपेक्षाएं हैं उनसे? कोई नौकरी देने वाला सामने और आप जैसे लोग मिल जाए तो उसके तो मजे हो जाए देने वाले के। हमारा काम था सामाजिक सुरक्षा के लिए कि लोगों की सामाजिक सुरक्षा कैसे हो, और एक बड़े काम का एक हिस्सा था कि अलग अलग सेक्टर के जो लोग हैं उनकी सामाजिक सुरक्षा हो। तो सामाजिक सुरक्षा पेंशन की चीजों पे हम काम कर रहे थे। उसी दरमियान ये समझ में आया कि एक बहुत बड़ा वर्ग है जिसकी कोई सामाजिक सुरक्षा की बात नहीं हो रही हो, तो कहीं रिकॉग्नाइज भी नहीं, वो बहुत बड़ा ग्रुप है।
I think a good place to start is to start with the proposition that there is nothing actually called the gig economy. There's a plumber, and the plumber's arrangement of work is that every day the plumber may have 3 different or 5 different or 10 different people that they work for. Somebody has a leaky faucet, they call him or her, goes there, fixes it. Somebody else has a blocked drain, they go there, fix that. So they are moving, quote unquote, between employers. As against that, you take let's say a taxi driver, they're not being employed by the person who is riding in their car. As against that, let's say if you take something like the couriers, DHL or FedEx, etc., you have a driver who has got a load to deliver in a particular area, and they are an employee of FedEx or of DHL, and they're driving around. Now, if you put a technological interface across all these pieces of work, all the kind of different kinds of work that is produced, and you say that that's why it's the gig, there's something smart about doing it. There is no organic unity to the whole thing. I think that's the first thing to realize, that there's nothing really called the gig. There are multiple industries, and as technology has developed, we've had technological interfaces come into play.
Gig workers are actually used to define a very broad category of workers who are peace state workers, basically workers who are being compensated for clearly defined tasks that they complete. More than 90% of the workers employed in our country, for instance, today in the unorganized informal sector are gig workers because they are not permanent employees. They are not compensated just because they are working for a couple of hours a day, but it's actually for how much quantum of work that they produce.
It's interesting that we should begin this conversation by asking the question as to who is a gig worker and how is that gig worker defined. Since gig and platform work has been relatively new in India, there was no law covering that subject, and one would therefore presume that ordinary labor law would apply to them. If you ask me who is a worker, then a worker is somebody who is selling his labor power in order to earn a livelihood. And those who buy that labor power generally exploit the workers and make a profit out of that labor power.
Let's say if I'm sitting in the worker's chair and you're sitting in the boss's chair, whether I'm an independent contractor or some kind of a dependent contractor or an employee is defined by how much you direct me, how much you control me. When you have a leaky faucet and you call a plumber, you're not telling the plumber, use that kind of a spanner or use that kind of a cork. You're not telling the plumber anything because you don't know anything about plumbing. You're just a customer. And the plumber makes all the decisions on how to do what they do as long as they stop the faucet from leaking. As against that, let's say if you are a DHL delivery worker, then every single thing that you do, the parcels that come into your van, the route that you take to drop each package off in each different office building or apartment building, is all determined by DHL. So in that sense, the plumber is a true independent contractor. The DHL driver is a true employee. Take an Uber driver or take a food delivery worker. Everything is supposedly flexible. You can start when you want to start. Nobody is telling you when to start your shift. Nobody is telling you when to end your shift. That's what they play out. So there's that element of flexibility that sounds like the plumber's job. Nobody's telling the plumber when to start his or her job. But look at the rest of it. The GPSs tell you what route to follow. The rate that they can charge is entirely structured by Uber. The money first goes to the Uber account and then comes to the driver. So every single thing is controlled by Uber. So in that sense, an Uber driver is an employee. The gigification of work is an attempt to kind of obfuscate an employee-employer relationship. And the way they've done it is fascinating. I think the person you should follow is Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. He had no hesitation in saying that their business, core to their business model, part of how they gained competitive advantage was by using this mask of technology. You would walk into an industry and just break every rule, every regulatory framework that has been set up over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Let's break the rules and then negotiate. It's what I call what a hoodlum does on a street. Two groups in a neighborhood are having a fight. One of the standard strategies that a hoodlum uses is to first walk in the middle and smack somebody silly on their face. They smash into somebody. And then you say, okay, now let's negotiate and come to a compromise. That's what the Ubers of the world have done. That's what the Swiggies of the world have done. That's what all of these gig lords have done. They walked into industries that had frameworks of regulation that were fairly well organized, and they've just, first thing they do is take a big bloody club and smash into everything and destroy it. So now they can renegotiate. And that's the process we are in the middle of right now.
This is something that's not very new to India. It's something that's traditionally been a part of how work arrangements have been rolling out in the country. But platform-based gig workers has been this novel development where gig work is being administered and arranged through a digital platform. So it's workers who are being compensated on a piece rate basis, but where the work allocation, where the work monitoring is not being done through a manager, through a factory floor, or through a physical office, but it is being mediated through a digital platform. So this subset of workers are platform-based gig workers. All are Uber drivers, Ola drivers, Rapido bike riders, food delivery happening through Zomato, Swiggy, urban company providing home-based services, and courier services like Flipkart, Amazon, eCart are all considered platform-based gig workers.
हमने क्यों बुलाई ये ट्रेनिंग या जो सत्र कर रहे हैं हम, गिग वर्कर भी हैं, उनके साथ जो काम करते हैं वो लोग भी हैं। गिग वर्कर जो हैं वो भी देश दुनिया में एक बहुत बड़ी संख्या में बढ़ रहे हैं और वो नई अवधारणा आई तो उसका कोई कानूनी स्वरूप नहीं था अब तक पूरी दुनिया में नहीं एक तरह से। तो जो जिस बात की हम बात कर रहे थे, हमने कहा कि संविधान है तो कानून है तो उससे अधिकार आते हैं, अधिकार आते हैं तो हमें हिम्मत मिलती है कि हम लोगों के साथ बातचीत करें, अपने हकों के लिए लड़ पाए। तो वो कोई यदि कानूनी आधार नहीं होता है तो लोग खड़े नहीं हो सकते। एक नई अवधारणा है तो उन गिग वर्कर्स को भी पता नहीं है कि वो किस तरह की समस्याओं से जूझ रहे हैं, वो कंपनियां कौन हैं जिनसे वो कैसे बात कर सकते हैं, उनका साथ जुड़ाव कैसे हुआ, उनको जो दिक्कतें आती है उसको कैसे वो डील करें। तो इन सब चीजों के बारे में एक कानून राजस्थान में बना है। ये कानून पूरे दुनिया में पहला कानून है जो यहाँ के राजस्थान के लोगों ने सरकार से मिलकर एक तरह से बनाया है।
While we call them gig workers, the aggregators refer to them as partners because the aggregators believe that they are doing no other job but connecting a person who demands a service, for instance, customers like you and me, to those who are actually in a condition to provide the service, who are actually these workers. So the intermediaries argue that they are just a bridge connecting those who are demanding to those who are supplying the service, and hence have actually no responsibility or obligation towards these workers in the form which is mandated through many labor laws.
तो खुला सत्र है, आधे घंटे के लिए रहेगा, तो आप हाथ ऊपर करें और जो बात आप कहना चाहते हैं वो करें।
तो स्विगी में तो दिक्कत ये है कि ऐसे शिफ्ट आई 1 से 10 भरतपुर में राइडर्स की, तो कंपनी बोलती है 10 बजे तक लॉग इन करो, पर जो वहाँ के फ्लीट मैनेजर उन्हें फोर्स करते हैं तुम्हें 12 या 11 तक तो रहना ही है, नहीं तो आईडी बंद कर दूंगा तुम्हारी। पर कंपनी तक हमारी बात पहुंचती नहीं है, कोई ऑप्शन ही नहीं है बात पहुंचाने का, क्योंकि कोई ऑफिस नहीं है।
इसके अलावा लिफ्ट वगैरह यूज नहीं करने देते, डाक वगैरह का भी लिफ्ट वगैरह यूज नहीं करने देते।
हमारे पास कोरियर आते हैं, हमारे सीनियर हमें कोरियर तो दे देते हैं, उनकी हेडेक सारी हम पे आ जाती है। कम से कम 8 घंटे से लेकर 12 घंटे के बीच में हमें बाइक चलानी पड़ती है। क्या हो रहा है क्या नहीं हो रहा है गाड़ी से संजय उन्हें कोई मतलब नहीं है, उन्हें सिर्फ पेमेंट और कोरियर देने से मतलब है।
और सर जैसे कि मान लो राइडर पुराना हो गया, काफ़ी समय से काम कर रहा है, तो कंपनी को उससे कोई मतलब नहीं है। ऑर्डर असाइनमेंट प्रोसेस होता है, उसमें अगर नया राइडर आएगा उसको टिकाने के लिए उसी को कम से कम 1 महीने अच्छे ऑर्डर देगी, बोल देगी कि हाँ 20 से 25 हज़ार कम जाएंगे, आ जाओ ज्वाइन कर लो। उससे उल्टी सीधी पेनल्टी लगा देगी, नया राइडर उसे कुछ मतलब लगेगा नहीं, वो छोड़ के चला जाएगा। ये धंधा बना रखा है कंपनी ने, आओ ज्वाइन करो, और ज्वाइनिंग तो चलती रहती है। पैसे पुराना हो गया, 2 साल हो गए, 3 साल हो गई, तो उसको तो काम ज़्यादा देना चाहिए ना, और पैसा भी अच्छा देना चाहिए, इससे कोई मतलब नहीं है। और ज़्यादा वो बोलो तो आप नेता मत बनो या फिर छोड़ दो, यही लास्ट में रहता है उनका बस कंपनी का।
मान लो हमको कुका से जाना है, बुकिंग मिल जाती है लेकिन उधर से बुकिंग नहीं मिलती, कस्टमर से एक्स्ट्रा पेमेंट मांगते हैं, कस्टमर कहता है कि हम कंप्लेंट डाल देंगे आपकी आईडी ब्लॉक हो जाएगी, लेकिन उधर से हमें खाली आना पड़ता है। 30 किलोमीटर खाली आओ, क्या मतलब रहता है मैडम इस पर?
अब टाइम लगता है, ट्रैफिक में लग जाते हैं, जो ठंडा हो ही जाता है नॉर्मली, उधर से वो कंप्लेन करता है दूसरा जिसके पास कस्टमर है, खाना ठंडा हो गया है, कंपनी किस पे आती है, हम पे ब्लेम करती है। अब ऑर्डर तो कंपनी ने एक साथ ही लिया ना, हमारे तो पहले ही वाले ठंडा हो गया, दूसरा वाले तो गर्म जाएगा, तो ऐसी बहुत कॉमन प्रॉब्लम है। इसके चक्कर में पहले स्विगी की आईडी थी ना, वो ब्लॉक ही हो गई, वो तो कभी दोबारा फिर जोमेटो की दूसरी आईडी बनानी पड़ी हमें।
और अगर हम कुछ भी मतलब बोलें कि हमें ये दिक्कत है ज़्यादा या संगठन सा बन जाए, तो बोलते हैं क्यों काम कर रहे हो, मत करो, कोई दिक्कत थोड़ी है, और कुछ कर लो। और ऐसे ही सबको एक बार सब छोड़ दें तो कंपनी रोड पे आ ही जाएगी।
तो लोगों की मतलब इमेज इस तरीके से बनी हुई है कि यार ये गरीब है, मतलब छोटा है तभी टैक्सी चला रहा है। टैक्सी ड्राइवर की कभी गलती भी नहीं होती ना, सामने वाला उसकी प्राइवेट गाड़ी कोई सी भी हो, छोटी से बड़ी, जरा सी बात हो जाती है ना, सामने वाला स्पीड नहीं चढ़ता उसे, क्योंकि टैक्सी ड्राइवर है।
अब रोड खराब है, अब बारिश है, हमने तो डाल दिया कि सर आगे गड्ढा है, और कस्टमर ने बोल दिया सर गड्ढा नहीं है, तो गड्ढे में से निकल के जाएगा राइडर।
And it is these workers who are under the most amount of stress today because they're having to work many number of hours to earn a basic minimum income. They are having to work in very difficult work conditions. The heat wave that much of North India is reeling under is affecting these workers particularly. They are having to be on the road, facing pollution in very adverse weather conditions. Primary device which is mediating their whole work is something that's hanging because of the heat, but you can still see that they're working 15 to 16 hours a day.
How much of human labor has been involved? Just to give you an example, in 2020 सारे जो delivery associates हैं, they travel around the amount of distance that they travel. If you put it together, it will be 960 times around the world, just during the Great Indian Festival of Amazon in 2020. And the weight of the packages that they carry is equivalent to 10,000, that of 10,000 elephants. ये मैंने Amazon के वेबसाइट से ही लिया है।
मजदूर और मालिक का जो रिश्ता होता है, उस मालिक को क्या क्या देना चाहिए, उसकी भी एक नैतिक जिम्मेदारी है ना। एग्रीमेंट हो गया, और
एक सर्टिफिकेट भी होना चाहिए उनके एक्सपीरियंस का, भाई इतने साल तक वो इतना काम,
एक्सपीरियंस सर्टिफिकेट मिले, और सम्मान देना चाहिए, सम्मान मिलना चाहिए बिल्कुल।
Between the 1920s, 30s in the West, and from about the 1947 onwards in a country like India, workers won a lot of rights. Provident fund, all sorts of social security benefits, all sorts of protections against how you can get fired or not get fired, grievance mechanisms. It's an entire framework on what is the relationship between capital and the worker. Those were hard-fought victories. It took over close to 70, 80 years of workers' struggles to make those victories happen. Once the world wars were over, things settled down all across the world. Many of the countries became independent, third world countries became independent, and around 20 years later, some of those more confrontational, spirited battles were fading as capital gained an edge again in the 80s and the 90s, started trying to rewrite all of this. And in that sense, the gig idea that obfuscates all these relationships tries to destroy everything that workers have gained over years is coming from a very particular class of capitalists, as a matter of fact, I'd say, in the sense that starting about the 80s, finance capital began to dominate the world. Starting about the 2000s, about 20 years into this period when the finance capitalists were dominating the world, you started having the situation wherein a particular class of finance capitalists, what I would call private equity capital, that is all the equity funds, all the venture capital, they began to dominate even within the sector of finance capital. And they really started trying to rewrite all these rules.
Since gig and platform work has been relatively new in India, there was no law covering that subject, and one would therefore presume that ordinary labor law would apply to them. Well, in that context, when gig and platform work started, we find that the Social Security Code of 2020, that is one of the 4 codes which the Government of India has adopted, that code deals with who is a gig worker and who is a platform worker. I would not hesitate to go to the extent of saying that the definition clauses provided in the Social Security Code, so far as these 2 categories of workers are concerned, was meant in order to preempt those workers from getting the benefit of labor law. And in that sense, I think it's the aggregator's version of who is a gig worker and platform worker that has been incorporated into the law. Well, this is not strange because all over the world they attempted to do so. But gradually, global jurisprudence has been shifting in favor of the workers, and there is an attempt to define the gig and platform workers in a more robust and honest manner.
हम में से कितने लोग अपने आप को मानते हैं कि हम इस कंपनी में वर्कर है, मतलब मजदूरी कर रहे हैं, मतलब दिन का काम कर रहे हैं और उस दिन का काम मिल रहा है?
So the one big reason why aggregators refer to platform-based gig workers as partners and not employees and labor is only because they do not want to come under the ambit of the labor regulations. This is not a phenomenon unique to India. Everywhere in the world, this is the trick in the book that's been applied. You've had protests, you've had resistances, so court interventions. Because these workers are termed as partners, they lose a whole set of rights that they would otherwise be entitled to if they would be recognized as labor. For instance, the right to minimum wage, the right to minimum conditions at the workplace, minimum safety conditions, minimum social security. So these are a whole set of rights related to income, safety at work, occupational health standards and social security that they are currently devoid of because they are pushed away from the definition of employees and are being termed as partners. Essentially, even when you use the word partner, it's not essentially that they're a partner in the profits or in any corporate gains by these aggregators, right?
अगर मान लो मैं गाड़ी चला रहा हूँ, मेरा 100 रुपये का पेट्रोल जला, अगर ऑर्डर नहीं भरा तो उसका 50 रुपये कौन देगा? कंपनी देने जाए ना, पार्टनर तो मतलब वही है.
इसीलिए कंपनी आपको इतना बड़ा चौड़ा सुंदर शब्द कहती है कि आप वर्कर नहीं हो, आप तो उससे बड़े हो, आप तो पार्टनर हो.
So the aggregators, their intention is to deprive workers of all the protections available under labor law. And for that, they are using a definition which they have invented. Unfortunately, that definition has crept into the Social Security Code. By the way, Social Security Code is only one among 4 codes. For example, if you're thinking of the right to unionization, that is not covered by the Social Security Code. It's covered by the Industrial Relations Code. And this definition in the Social Security Code cannot be presumed to apply to the Industrial Relations Code. So it's a half-hearted and inadequate attempt made to push workers into a particular category. But more important, when we are talking of not falling into the definition trap, we are saying we need a new legislation. And so what we have done is to create a legislation. We have submitted this to the government of Karnataka in 2023. The moment this law is enacted, then it is not the choice of the aggregators whether they should abide by it. Law is binding on them, and that's the process by which we'll bring about social change. So they have no choice in the matter. We are rejecting the definition in the Social Security Code and recommending other definitions, and especially using the fact that even state governments can do so because labor law falls in the concurrent list.
हल चला के खेतों को मैंने ही सजाया रे, हल चला के खेतों को मैंने ही सजाया रे, गेहूं चावल मक्के के दानों को उगाया रे, गेहूं चावल मक्के के दानों को उगाया रे, चूल्हा भी जलाया रे, धान को पकाया रे, चूल्हा भी जलाया रे, धान को पकाया रे, तुम भूखे पेट रे, ये मेरे लिए काम नहीं, रहूं तुम भूखे पेट रे, ये मेरे लिए काम नहीं, धागे को बनाया मैंने मीलों को चलाया रे, धागे को बनाया मैंने मीलों को चलाया रे, ताना बाना जोड़ के कपड़ा बनाया रे, ताना बाना जोड़ के कपड़ा बनाया रे, संसद का हर एक खंभा मैंने ही उठाया रे, संसद का हर एक खंभा मैंने ही उठाया रे, सपनों के रंगों से उनको सजाया रे, सपनों के रंगों से उनको सजाया रे, मुझे कफन नहीं रे कि मेरे लिए काम नहीं, मुझे कफन नहीं रे कि मेरे लिए काम नहीं, सपने सजाएंगे जिंदगी बनाएंगे, सपने सजाएंगे जिंदगी बनाएंगे, उंगलियों को मोड़ के हाथों को उठाएंगे, उंगलियों को मोड़ के हाथों को उठाएंगे, आसमां को छुएंगे जिंदाबाद गाएंगे, आसमां को छुएंगे जिंदाबाद गाएंगे, लड़ेंगे तब तक रे कि जब तक काम नहीं, लड़ेंगे तब तक रे कि जब तक काम नहीं.
We can see that over the past decade, the profile of workers, gig workers who are entering this sector has been changing. There have been some studies that have come out, the Niti Aayog, National Council of Applied Economic Research, NIMHANS recently in Karnataka have come out to do studies on what is the class composition, social composition of these workers, what are the wages that they're earning, what are the conditions under which they're working. But earlier we saw that there were a lot of people who were given lots of promises of the minimum earnings that they would come up with. They invested a lot in terms of capital, in terms of cars that they purchased. And you had a class of workers who were quite taken in, were quite excited by the prospects of platform-based gig work and the additional opportunity it provided because it gave space for doing this on a part-time basis. But we have seen that it was during COVID when a lot of people, when much of India's workforce faced an employment shock, wages were affected, conditions of work were problematic, we saw a huge numbers of people actually move towards platform-based gig work. And now we're seeing that it's the general profile of workers who are engaged in this sector are the ones who are really now primarily dependent on platform-based gig work to earn a minimum wage. This is their primary livelihood. This very class of workers, while much of affluent India was working from home during COVID, platform-based gig workers who were transporting medicines, who were providing food, who were helping in the movement of essential commodities, they were even termed COVID warriors.
Look at what's happened in New York City in the last, 6 years, 5 years. It's a story of victories for workers and story of there are tragedies in the middle. In 2018, we had 9 driver suicides. drivers killing themselves because they couldn't survive in the industry that had been created. And as a union, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance fought a public battle. Between the months of January and August, there were 23 public actions around City Hall, around the mayor's office, around the Taxi Limousine Commission, bridges being blocked, direct action by workers. And in the end, we won. We won a formula by which every Uber and Lyft driver in New York City would earn above minimum wage based on a formula that was created by the city. That is, Uber no longer could say, this is what we are paying the driver. Uber had to show that its occupancy rates were above a certain level, etc., etc. Second, Uber and Lyft and all these companies were stopped from putting new cars on the streets of New York. Right now, let's say in a city like Bangalore, there are 1 lakh Uber, Ola, Nammayatri, whatever. You put another 20,000 cars. Whose income is it going to eat into? The income of the drivers that exist. Companies will still continue to make the money because for every one ride that the earlier condition missed and the 20,000 new cars will pick up, they're going to make more money. In 2023, we just had the single largest settlement in the New York State Attorney General's history, where Uber agreed to pay $328 million back to drivers that they had skimmed off drivers every transaction by purposely miscalculating how tax was to be levied. They skimmed 20 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents, 40 cents of every ride. The fact that they settled with New York State and agreed to pay into the unemployment insurance funds. These victories have happened because drivers have organized, because there's a union that's strong. The Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers, the union here in India, has been slowly accumulating power. And the sign of how you have something like the IFAT accumulating power comes from the fact that now multiple governments are scrambling, are trying to race to be the government that is going to enact new laws. Every party had to make it part of their election manifestos. Where they'll deliver after election manifestos is a different matter, but they were forced to put it on their election manifestos. A political figure like Rahul Gandhi, whatever one may think of him, during the Bharat Jodo Yatra, made the gig economy part of his discourse. We're beginning to see that happen. We're beginning to see that happen all across Latin America. There are some historic rulings in the UK Supreme Court that they were entitled to certain benefits like sick days, vacation days, minimum wage. All of those laws were applicable. And the more power that workers build, the more they communicate with consumers, the more power that consumers bring to bear, I think we'll begin to see all these industries shift. That curve is just beginning. All these business models are bound to get renegotiated.
Both the European Union as well as the ILO has been addressing the question which they call as misclassification of workers. That's an interesting terminology with global ramifications. And the movement in that regard has been to say, you can't use terminology in order to deprive workers of their basic rights. That's a welcome development. The European Union's declaration has adopted that standard and said that there will be a presumption that workers are workers. And if at all you want to challenge that, then the burden of proof will fall on the employer. I must say that we have used a new legal technique, and that legal technique we have borrowed from the vast number of typologies of labor law that are available in India. One such typology, especially that law which deals with sales representatives, that law does not ask the question as to how to define a worker. It simply says all those who are covered by this law will enjoy the following benefits. We've used the same technique, and we are saying that any person who's working in any of these employments, including what may be listed in the schedule, they shall be treated as people, as persons who are covered by the law that we are proposing. So in that sense, my preference is to say, don't fall into the definitional clause trap. Instead, move away from it. Indian labor law gives you enough space to move away, and that way you can protect what has been denied to those who legitimately need it.
You and I will both agree that the job of a publicly traded company is to maximize profits. That's not a problem. That's what they promise their shareholders. I will never call a company greedy or not greedy. That's what they're supposed to do. What I'm saying is that there is a long history of capitalism's development, workers responding, governments intervening, strikes happening, novels being written, poetry being written, people shouting on the streets, at the end of which there are negotiated frameworks that have emerged, which says that there's somebody called an employee and somebody called an employer. And this is what defines that relationship. Uber or any company can call a person sitting in the worker's chair whatever they want to call that person. They can call that person a penguin. But that doesn't change the fact that they are essentially an employee because they control the worker in the ways that they do.
1.5 महीने से तनख्वाहें रोक के रखे हुए हैं। गुजारिश है तेलंगाना GIG प्लेटफॉर्म से कि हमारे अमाउंट हमारे को दिलाइए।
When platform-based gig workers have problems in their execution of work, and in fact even when customers have issues with execution of an order, your only recourse is chatting with a bot on the platform. You're prompted with questions, you have to choose between a set of answers that the bot is providing. If you are lucky to be able to cross a stage of conversation with the bot, there will be a call that will be made to you. You don't have a toll-free number to which you can reach out and make a call. You have to wait for the call to come to you.
So you're saying none of the companies have toll-free numbers?
I can't comprehensively say it, but based on everyone I've interacted with, which is across a set of platforms, that's what's been shared repeatedly, that they don't have a single number to call to and they don't have a single person to whom they can make a complaint to. When the complaint gets filed, if you have been successful in terms of communicating your issue, you get an acknowledgement for a ticket that is raised. You don't have a right to have your grievance redressed within a stipulated time frame at a minimum level. Different aggregators may have different timelines, but you have to wait for the redressal as and when it comes from the aggregator. In the process of that redressal, you don't have a right to just basic principles of natural justice. When your complaint is shared with a manager, with a team lead, they don't have any basic obligation to come to the work site, to visit you, to listen to your point of view, but they will actually take a decision based on the information that they have. So just the principles of natural justice, where you have a right to being heard in a decision that's going to affect you, are sometimes not complied with. Workers just have to deal with the final decision taken on their grievance while they had no participation in the process of the redressal or in the process of inquiry of that grievance.
पॉकेट बैलेंस होता है कि हमने उस ऑर्डर को डिलीवर कर दिया है, उसके ऊपर चढ़ा दिया और उसकी आईडी भी ब्लॉक कर दी। जो हमारा टीम लीडर होते हैं उनके पास गए, इस बात को रखा, मैंने एक वीडियो सी समय बना दी थी कि हमारे साथ ये चीज हो रही है, तो हम उसके पास टीम लीडर के पास गए। 12 तारीख को हमारे साथ ये चीज थी और अभी तक 6-7 मार्च हो गई है, कोई इसको रिस्पॉन्स नहीं आया। उसकी आईडी ब्लॉक पड़ी है, उसको 4,500 रुपए चढ़ रखे हैं। जब तक वो अपनी जेब से उस पैसों को भरेगा नहीं, उसकी आईडी बंद नहीं होगी। टीम लीडर को बोला है तो हर बार वो यही कहते हैं कि हमने आगे मेल कर रखा है, हमने आगे मेल कर रखा है। तो मैंने एक वीडियो बनाई तो उन्होंने मेरी भी आईडी टर्मिनेट कर दी और जो मेरे साथ में आते चले थी ना, तो उन सबकी आईडी टर्मिनेट कर दी। अब फिर अभी जो वीडियो जो मैंने बनाई थी, उन्होंने मेरे से ये कहा कि डिलीट करो वीडियो को और मेरे से माफी वगैरह मांगवाई, मेरे से कि पर्चे लिखवाया कि आप एक वीडियो रिकॉर्ड करवाइए कि आप दोबारा ऐसी वीडियो नहीं बनाएंगे क्योंकि उससे इन्फ्लुएंस होता है। अगर जो हमारे साथ होगा तो उसे तो हम सामने रखेंगे।
Officers who are supposed to take action on grievances are all based within aggregators themselves. There is no independent grievance redress office or an organization. It's again just basic principles of law that you don't go to the very same entity that is the cause of the complaint when you're filing a grievance. Today, when a constable at the police station is not taking my FIR, you can't tell me to go and file a complaint with the constable itself that he's not taking my FIR. You go to somebody else, you go to the supervisor of the constable, or you have a different grievance entity who's responsible for taking grievance. So basic principles of independence are not aligned with. You go to the very same framework or organization organization that you have a problem against. If you are not satisfied with the redressal of your grievance, your appellate system where you can go to appeal is not independent. Some entities may have appellate structures, some may not, but even those that have it are within the organization, within the corporate entity and not independent of it. So this is the reason grievance redress structures are not objective, are not fair and are not accessible to workers based on the hundreds of conversations and interactions we've had with workers. And the biggest issue that workers face today, and many of them who you'll interact with, for instance in Urban Company, Uber, Ola, are termination of IDs. Blocking of IDs. They don't understand a single complaint by a customer can prompt blocking of an ID, even if on a temporary basis, while aggregators argue that contracts include an exhaustive list of grounds on the basis of which aggregators have the power to block IDs. The first problem remains that these workers don't even have their physical copies of their contracts with them. They digitally accept them and sign them, and afterwards they don't have a downloadable, readable format that they can keep referring back to. And even then, when their IDs are blocked, they don't have a chance to contest why their ID was blocked. And we have seen now over the past 2-3 years that workers who organize protests, who organize resistance, who start asking questions in WhatsApp groups, they are being targeted by their IDs being blocked, by allocation of work coming down. So it's a really dangerous instrument in the hands of platforms because they can do it almost invisibly, and workers are just left running pillar to post to try and sort it out.
I have seen these contracts. When we started this work, those contracts were still available on their handheld machine. Then when many of us started quoting the terms and conditions of the contract, then the system changed and the contract would be available only for you to say, I agree, and after that it would disappear, you're right. Even if that contract is given in writing and made available to the workers, still under the Indian Contract Act, which is not labor law, under the Indian Contract Act, there is section 16, which says an unconscionable contract is no contract at all. All these would fall under unconscionable contract. How do you decide whether something is unconscionable? Is there a balance of bargaining power between the one who's offering the contract and the one who's signing the contract? Is it exploitative? Is it economic exploitation? Is it exploitation, using the tremendous unemployment that prevails? If it is so, it's an unconscionable contract and a voidable contract. That means if the workers don't want to follow that contract, the employer can do nothing about it. Even if they are accessible, they are voidable because of the terms and conditions that are signed between unequal partners. Right. There must be a free exchange. If I contract with you, you must have the freedom to say yes or no. These fellows are a part of the unemployed army, and therefore they'll only say yes in order to get a pie out of it. A contract is supposed to be consensus ad idem, meeting of free minds. You must give your free consent. Here all the consents are vitiated consent, and therefore they are all illegal contracts in a manner of speech, at least voidable contracts. Socially speaking, at a level of policy, they are anathema. They can't stand the scrutiny of public policy, and yet they continue because our legal machinery is so defunct. Law can take care of this easily. In the law, you can prescribe a standard contract form, and you can say the employer must follow this form and give it to the employee. And if the employer does not do so, then the standard form will apply. Finished.
Is that part of the new legislation?
Yes, it can be brought in. We have provisions similar to that. Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act is a legislation which prescribes minimum conditions which must be observed by the employer. And what has happened even in this government here is that the IT sector has brought its influence in order to claim exemption from that law, and they have got the exemption. The IT sector, the so-called big corporates, they don't want to apply that minimum standard to their employees.
And on what basis did they get this exemption?
Political influence. To the best of my knowledge, it is against the advice of the Labour Secretariat, the Labour Minister, but the Cabinet decided to give the exemption. It is an exemption which was existing. They have extended the exemption now. So what is the meaning of a contract? A contract will have a number of terms and conditions in the contract. That means if one of the parties wants to say, this contract is not binding on me because it is an unconscionable contract, then the contract falls through, provided that one side says we don't want this contract. It was obtained by the wrong means, by fraud, by coercion, by undue influence, by misrepresentation. All that are the standard parameters of a contract. If anybody enters into a contract with another person using any of these methods, then such a contract is a vitiated contract. In ideal cases, it can be a void contract. In the case of Section 16, it's a voidable contract. So let's say there are 12 terms of terms and conditions, and which says that if you don't come to work on all days of the week regularly, you will be penalized. No, that term of contract is unconscionable. Generally, we agree that within 7 days there must be 1 day a week, a holiday. So that's a voidable contract, and as a result, employer, whatever action he takes on account of that and punishes will be illegal. So that's the benefit of a voidable contract. I'm quoting this as a matter of public policy. Let me tell you which year this law is. 1872. The Indian Contract Act is 1872. So even at that point of time, that is the consciousness about public law. And that is what these fellows are violating. And so it's a lack of public consciousness about minimum legal standards and jurisprudence that allows them to carry on with this kind of contracts.
What are the implications of voidable contracts?
Implication is that employer cannot enforce that contract. If he enforces it, that enforcement is illegal, provided the person who is victim challenges and says this is unconscionable contract. That dismissal is illegal.
So blocking of IDs based on participation in protest can be considered as illegal termination.
That also you have to relate it to the contract. Most of those contracts will say things like that. They go to the extent of saying you shall not be a member of a trade union. Article 19(1)(c) of the Constitution of India says it's your fundamental right to be in the trade union. They'll still say you better sign and tell me that I won't become a member of a trade union. It's the grossest violation of constitutional law in India. But it's happening.
Don't these aggregators have corporate lawyers who know this is a violation of constitutional law?
All of them put together have succeeded in putting it into the Social Security Code by saying the labor law will not apply to them. And now Rajasthan and Karnataka and Telangana are fighting against it. That's the way law changes. It's always an uphill task. Law is an instrument of social change. And we have to change the status quo, which is dictated by the aggregators and their well-paid lawyers. And that is what is written into this law. So the central government is party to that. That's the difficulty.
सरकारें सोच रही हैं कि हम और आप जो काम करते हैं कम से कम पैसा दें उनको और ज्यादा से ज्यादा काम कैसे ले सकते हैं। ये हमको समझना है ये सारी चीजें कि क्या सोचती हैं सरकारें हमारे बारे में। 90 करोड़ मजदूर हैं इस पूरे देश में, उनके बारे में उनका सोच क्या है।
Ironically, as of today, the platform-based gig workers come under the nodal department of METI, which is the Information Technology Department in the Ministry in the Government of India. And that's because, like I had mentioned, all these digital platforms are not even registered as taxi service providers, food delivery platforms, or courier services. They're registered as digital intermediaries because they insist that they're doing no other job apart from providing a platform that acts as a bridge between a customer who's demanding something and a professional who can cater to that demand. So the nodal ministry as of today is the IT ministry, and workers are really frustrated because they currently don't have a nodal department that they can go to and explain their grievances to.
That's why they're called aggregators, right? Because their claim is that all they are doing is producing a software that aggregates. But that's the ambiguity. That's what I mean by saying that you're offering a taxi service, but trying to obfuscate it by saying there's any number of court rulings across the world that says, no, you're not a software vendor. If you try and operate like this, the way you're operating, you are a taxi company. You are the equivalent of that. You go to a city like New York. New York City is very clear. You are going to be governed by the Taxi and Limousine Commission. You are not going to be governed by some IT sector rules. You're not going to be covered by some service sector rules. You're going to be governed by the Taxi and Limousine Commission. Every single fare that's produced on the streets of New York is part of that. Every single fare is recorded and reported to the Taxi and Limousine Commission, where drivers have a certain set of rights, where the the companies that are registered as part of providing these for-hire vehicle services have a certain set of responsibilities and rights. So it's all very clear. In India, they have managed to do obfuscated this far, which is why I'm saying as these regulations move in, now it's the labor ministries that are being forced to take this serious.
So far our outreach has been towards the labor ministry because we believe that is the ministry that has to be in the center of the conversation. The labor ministry has to take steps which protect and bat for the interest of workers. The Ministry of Labor has organized many national and state level consultations on platform-based gig workers, some of them even in collaboration with the International Labour Organization. And like I mentioned, specific G20 events were organized to come together and conceptualize and think about what must be done for platform-based gig workers. These were fronted by the Ministry of Labour, but we have still not seen them walk the talk. We have not seen from statements any other firm action taken.
चर्चा चल रही थी राजस्थान में भी और पूरे राज्य में, देश में, इनकी सामाजिक सुरक्षा की कोई प्रावधान कहीं नहीं थे। तो एक ऐसा कानून महाराष्ट्र में पहले बना था, उसको मथाड़ी बोर्ड कहते हैं, और वो कानून बना था हमाल जो लोग होते हैं, बोरी उठाने वाले लोग, मंडियों में जो काम करते हैं, उनके लिए कानून बना था 1964 में।
Mathadi law drew its inspiration from the Dock Workers Act, and that is in the 1940s. Even before independence, that process had started. That was a legislation where they found that when you're taking contract workers to the shipyards, etc., there has to be some kind of order in doing that. And so they created a kind of board, a regulatory board. And they gave provision for workers to come and register themselves on the board. But the important thing is those who registered onto that board became the employees of the board, not of some contractor. And so through the board, they recovered money from those for whom services were given. That money was then distributed in order to make sure that people got their minimum wage, they got their social security. And that law was borrowed by the Maharashtra trade union in respect of head load workers. So the Mathadi law is precisely that. And so there are some ideas in that where you're saying, let's use the cess that is collected and make it available for social welfare. So when you're saying that, let's have a per transaction collection of cess, then you use that cess in order to provide social security. What kind of social security? That in the Rajasthan law is left to the welfare board. So to that extent, they've borrowed an interesting idea, but they haven't gone as far as the Dock Workers Act, because that makes the board the employer. Here the employer is still the aggregator. So it's a step in that direction.
क्या राजस्थान में गिग वर्कर के लिए कानून है? जिनको लगता है हाथ उठा दीजिए। कानून है क्या गिग वर्कर के लिए राजस्थान में?
I think we must take note of the fact that the exploitation of gig and platform workers has been around for some time now, and there are various attempts to find a solution for it. The earliest, in a sense, the pioneering attempt in this regard was made by the government of Rajasthan. They did come out with a legislation that's the first of its kind in India, and through that legislation, they have tried to bring in certain minimum social welfare measures. The social welfare measures are not explicitly defined in that statute, but it leaves it to the welfare board. The welfare board has the power, and therefore they can decide what kind of social welfare measures to enact.
So there are 4-5 key provisions of this legislation. The first is there is going to be a tripartite board that's going to be constituted to look at the welfare of gig workers. This tripartite board is going to have representation from gig worker unions, government and aggregators. This formulation of having a tripartite board is not something that's just been invented with the gig workers law. I mean, there have been many legislations, particularly for unorganized workers, where the formulation of having a tripartite board was developed, tested and has shown to have great value. That's the first key provision, that all stakeholders will have a say in the decision making, and together they will come up with whatever decisions are required to be taken for the welfare of gig workers. So it's a means of trying to build a consensus on some key things. The second very important provision that this law talks about is that there is going to be automatic registration of platform-based gig workers working in the state. Usually, identification of welfare workers, their registration is always put as a burden on the workers themselves. They have to go from place A to place B, multiple offices with multiple documents trying to show that they actually exist and hence need to be registered. This law actually turns and shifts that burden on the aggregators. This is because aggregators have a ready database of who are the workers who are onboarded and who is working. So instead of putting the burden onto the workers, the law clearly states that the aggregators have to share information about all the workers who are registered on their platform. And there is an added provision that as and when workers onboard on platforms, they will be automatically registered with the state government and with the board. So this is a second key provision of the law. You have more than 7 lakh platform-based gig workers in the state, and when you have to provide them with social security benefits, where are the finances going to be raised from? In the law and throughout the advocacy of the law, we made it very clear that this is not something that we want government to make public allocations for separately. We don't want aggregators to put aside funds out of their charity. We wanted a way for this gig economy to finance the way for the social security itself, so that workers have an assurance that it is through their hard work and through their work that they're actually raising funds that are going to finance social security schemes for them. This is one of actually the most critical provisions in this law, that a welfare cess fee is going to be deducted on every transaction that takes place on any platform in the state. So whether it's a taxi service, whether it's food delivery, whether it's a courier service, or whether it's home-based service, every bill that is generated will now have a welfare cess fee that is added as a levy onto the bill. So for example, if I pay 100 rupees to get into an Uber and come from place A to place B, then the amount that goes to the worker, which is about 80%, and the 20% which goes to the aggregator, on that 80%, we are now going to deduct a welfare cess fee, and that is the portion that is put aside for the social security of that worker. So through this formulation, we are not only raising finances, we are cumulatively collecting social security levy from all the millions of transactions that actually make up the turnover of an aggregator. But along with that, we're also identifying through each transaction which worker has contributed to this work. So instantly we know who is the gig worker, who actually did the labor, who did the service, who generated this welfare cess fee, and hence who is eligible to actually partake in the social security benefits through that transaction. Khud ki mehnat ki kamai se they are generating their social security fee, so it's no one's charity. This is the third key provision for the law. The fourth provision is that there will be now a management information system where all the transactions, like I said, all the millions of transactions that make up the turnovers of these aggregators will now be mapped on a single portal, which will be accessible to the board and which will be accessible to the workers. So every worker will be able to see for themselves that on each transaction, how much money did the aggregator or the platform make, how much money did the worker make, and how much welfare cess fee has been deducted from that transaction. This granular access to information helps workers keep a track. It will help them actually monitor what is being collected in their name, and this will ensure that they'll be better able to enforce accountability of what is getting spent. The last key provision is of a dedicated grievance redress mechanism for platform-based gig workers. Workers, as of today, when they have grievances, the only way they can register it and be heard are through digital means right now. And some of these we see are applications run by the platform. Sometimes they have to chat with bots where they have to go through many processes to be able to explain what the actual grievance is, or they have to raise tickets online in order to submit a grievance. They don't have a physical person who they can call, explain their issue with. They don't have a physical office that they can go to. So in this scenario, the law conceptualizes that there will now be a grievance redress officer. The state government and the board will be responsible. People will have a right to report their grievances, get dated acknowledgement receipts for the grievances that they file, and ensure that their grievances will be redressed within a stipulated time frame. And in the redressal of this grievance, the entity that's responsible for redressing the grievance will hear both parties. They will hear the aggregator and they will hear the worker. So it's really giving space for the worker's right to be heard.
Social welfare measures or social security measures, they are hugely dependent upon how much of money is available in order to put those schemes into force. And the Social Security Code 2020 of the Government of India had already provided that you can deduct 1 to 2% of the turnover of each aggregator in order to recover a cess. Well, Rajasthan legislation goes one step further and they clarify that's a welcome idea, but what has to be done is it should be a deduction per transaction and not on the total turnover. I have attended some meetings where aggregators are there, and in the initial stages they were very much opposed to it. And we are not surprised, because turnover is something, depends upon the way in which your balance sheet is written and what chartered accountants help you in that process. Whereas the deduction per transaction is more clearly ascertainable. And therefore many of us prefer this deduction per transaction, and that money has to get into a proper fund. And that fund should be available to be electronically monitored, and the details of the each transaction should come on. So in that manner, we feel it's a better way to collect money for Social Security Code. So in that sense, it's an excellent measure. But the heavy emphasis has been on creating a welfare board, on leaving it to the welfare board to determine what kind of social security, and also to provide a grievance procedure through which any grievance may be tackled. A separate body has been created. So those are its main features, and it's a welcome step because it's the first of its kind.
And there's one particular advantage that we're also trying to drive through this law, is we've seen that digital technology and applications have really been the backbone of this industry and this economy. And so far, the digital technology is being used by the aggregators in order to put in place this work arrangement. It's being used by the customers for their convenience. The digital technology being designed is actually not helping the workers access their fair rights as labor. So in this legislation, we have really tried to turn around and say that if digital technology was actually used from labor or workers' point of view, how would that look like? That's why each of these key provisions, for example, automatic registration, it would not be possible if this work arrangement was not mediated through a digital platform. So we want to harness the advantages of digital technology and say that because now work allocation, work discovery, work measurement, work certification, all of this is being done digitally, automatic registration is a benefit that can be harnessed in favor of the workers because this entire operation runs digitally. Similarly, deducting a welfare cess fee per transaction is only possible when every single transaction is recorded digitally, when it's very clear what is the quantum of work that has been completed, what was the revenue raised. Transaction management information system also only possible when all records are digital. So this law in summation is also demonstrating an alternative to how digital technology can be conceptualized and used when the interest of workers is at the center of its conceptualization.
The entire business is because of this gig workers only. They have been in aggregators. The entire business transaction happens only because of these people. I feel they should have more sympathy, empathy, and consideration for such people who are creating business for them. The entire business model, Swiggy, Zomato, Flipkart, Amazon, all these businesses are basically driven because of these people only. I know it's more of an app-based, but the business is all happening on road 24/7, in and out, 365 days. It's their cost of life. They are going to make a business. This looks like more or less on this. So that's why I feel, the entrepreneurs or the new companies should really come and give more suggestion to the state
to see to that this the new law which we want to get in, it could be more friendly. We want to help all the stakeholders, and we want to get because we are not technically very sound. And as a government, as me, if you ask me, this is something new we are trying to get in. We are not really technical aware, neither we have got much expertise on this. So that's why I asked the stakeholders to come give their opinion rather than going back and trying to pass through the going for courts. I request them not to go and try to be hindering in this.
As you correctly pointed out, sir, whatever is contributed to that welfare fund also has to flow to the states, because these workers are working in separate states, sir. With that, sir, if there's an additional welfare fee that we're talking about at the state level, sir, one thing that I want to point out very specific to the food and grocery delivery industry, sir, any additional cost, the elasticity of demand is 1%.
I've attended more than 5-6 meetings now. Nobody has concerned about anything. You're trying to talk about central government rules and regulations, either you want to talk about transaction model. See, this is very difficult for us to do it. Okay, we want your advice and support to see that this goes through. Because it's not that easy to do it, and we are all spending hours together, and everybody, we respect everybody, but the mindset is nobody is thinking of a person who's on 16 hours, 15 hours road and doing a business. You have created an app where people are working onto this app. There is no noble cause, there is nothing great innovation is done. I'm sorry, don't mistake me otherwise. What is it you are trying to talk about? Earlier the same model was there. People used to stand on a road and take a taxi and go. If you don't have a consideration to the people who are contributing for your business,
including delivery partners,
what partners there? The lifeline for you. What partners there? You're telling that you will contribute to central government. You will contribute. You have got any data of minimum wages? How much people are earning? You're talking so much about rules and regulations. Everybody's talking about rules and regulations there. I've got any data that every person who's working with you, he has spent so many number of hours. You have got any data about it?
We ensure that the payout is.
I'm asking you, have you got any data? Your insurance is different. I don't deny to it.
When you look at it, from a point of view of legal scrutiny, I have no reason to doubt the fact certain provisions which were brought into the code are subsequent to the original drafting. You can make out when a clause is laterally introduced into a statute which was crafted earlier. And that kind of crafting has happened in respect of how to protect aggregators' interests. In addition to that, whenever we approach authorities, when it's the trade union and the workers' cause, it's a kind of an open hearing. But when it comes to the aggregators, their method of lobbying is very different. We hardly come to know how they lobby, but they are very reluctant to sit together with the trade union and the workers. One exception was when we were called for a meeting in Hyderabad. Principal Secretary Information Technology, he brought the aggregators and the worker representatives and academicians together, and that was one occasion on which we had an open debate. But after that, that has not happened. And so there is a tendency to do the serious lobbying and advocacy behind the screen. And it's an old practice, it continues. The ILO has taken a view that that's not the right way to proceed. ILO Convention number 144 speaks of tripartitism. India is a party to that convention. And so tripartite means all parties sit together. Labor, management, the Labor Department must sit together. But in the drafting of this legislation, I have not seen tripartitism in practice, except to the limited extent that was tried by the Telangana government.
So the Rajasthan law was a breakthrough, not because it is the perfect legislation that looks at all the sets of issues that gig workers face today. So by no means is the Rajasthan law being flagged as the perfect legislation that needs to be emulated all over. It was a breakthrough because it was the first legislative intervention that was made for the social security of gig workers. In that sense, it was the first intervention, which is why it's a breakthrough. The campaign that fought for the passage of this law, the Suchna Evam Rozgar Adhikar Abhiyan, made a very conscious decision to keep the remit of this legislation quite limited to social security. We were aware of what we're up against. We're up against the blue-eyed startup industry of this country, the capital they bring with it, the influence they have within government, and of course the might of government.
There's a another narrative, the narrative of startups, the narrative of success of startups, and how narratives of how these startups are bringing jobs, right? That narrative exists in this world, and that narrative is what has, of course, sustained these companies as kind of darlings of our society. Just compare it. Just compare how an ordinary middle-class consumer in India thinks about Uber or Ola or Swiggy from 5 years ago to now. I think you're seeing the shift. Most people have begun to see what these are. The bandwidth-constrained Indian middle class that is not able to see the levels of exploitation will be brought into this debate a little by little. Right now, yeah, they may be thinking, they may be still somewhere on that arc of seeing these as success stories, right? But the success stories are built on the backs of workers because the workers don't have the money that these companies have. The workers don't have the kind of power, but they have to build that power. They built that power through their union formations, etc. And as those stories begin to come out, I think we'll start seeing the changes. The game is not over, right? It's actually just started. We will redefine these business models. As I said, Uber has not made any profits. Ola has not really made much by way of profits. Why are these companies such darlings? Even their shareholders don't believe that they are, sustainable right now. We should not start from a framework wherein we feel that these stories are already determined. These stories have just begun. We're just 5, 6, 7 years into this fight. And I think the next 10 years will determine it.
We realized that we could not take on all the issues in one legislation, and it was important to make a strategic but yet a meaningful beginning. So that's why we felt that it was not politically or strategically wise at the point that we fought for this law to bring all the issues that gig workers face of inadequate income, wage theft, algorithmic issues, health issues, lack of growth within their own industry. We could not bring all of these issues into one legislation, and we decided to keep the focus limited to social security because we felt that was an issue that we could most vociferously fight for, where there was precedent in the past and we could make way for it. Provision of the law in terms of having a tripartite board where you have a board that's supposed to be accountable and listening to workers, a grievance redress procedure, the workers having a right to know about the details of every transaction. These are pathways that will open up for now workers to get more information, be able to have more spaces and platforms for saying, expressing what they want to say. And we hope that through this legislation, they can actually come together and mobilize and fight for a lot more.
In the meeting that took place in Hyderabad, it was interesting to note that the aggregators in a way conceded that there are problems which need to be attended. But there were 2 points on which they had their own strong approach. One was that the deduction of cess should be on the turnover and not per transaction. And the other was they claimed that many of them already have their own social welfare measures, and that should be allowed to continue and let it evolve on its own. There is no need for legislation to interfere. More or less saying, we will take care of our workers and let the law keep a distance. Those were the 2 major arguments that we heard when we met in Hyderabad.
Have you traveled any time on a bike? Should I travel करके देख लो, पता चलता है. Can you stand in one signal of any of the signals in Bangalore and just do 10 hours every day and be healthy?
Most of us agreed for transaction cost. Is the motive and objective of this meeting. Most of us we are agreeing for the transaction cost.
So बाप क्यों बात करें?
As saying, as a forum, we are as a corporate we are agreeing to.
आप उसके बाद में आप बात करो. You want to talk, right?
No.
You are from Jaipur, right? He said एक साल अभी तक आपको ड्राफ्ट नहीं मिला करके आपका रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ने बात किया था.
We will come back.
But if you don't know anything, then why are you talking there? मैं कुछ अलग बात कर रहा हूँ मेरे भाई. मेरे बातों से आपको तकलीफ हो रही है?
नहीं.
फिर क्यों फिर बीच में क्यों बात कर?
Absolutely appreciate your comments, sir. In terms of welfare initiative, sir, from the first right itself, sir, the organization covers for accidental insurance.
What is that you are doing? It's a great favor. What is your organization? Every organization has to do. I am also a businessman. I also do the same thing. What's the big deal about it? You are doing some noble cause. It's a mandatory by law. It's a provision. है तो आपका क्या उसमें? Because of these people only you are earning money. They have some sort of an idea towards those people, their family, their kids. उनका वेलफेयर के बारे में कोई आज तक एक आदमी बात नहीं कर रहा है. You are only trying to talk about central government. This man started with central government. You also added central government. She's also adding central government.
We asked them to do 1 page of notes. Only 1 page. Only 1 page note they did not use. You asked them, sir. I've asked them to do 1 page note.
You want to wait and watch because you have your legal team trying to read the rules and regulations, what is happening in central government and state government. Go get a stay on it. This is all your idea about your corporate companies, nothing else. So that's why we want your consent. Wool and over of दोनों businesses, Swiggy, Zomato, एक ही business है आपका? I'm right or wrong? If that is the case also, you can send your dissent letter also. That we are not in line of this draft. So we don't agree on this. Be open.
So there are other things also in the bill that we would at least like to provide some ideas.
Last 1 year, what we are trying to do then? We have been calling so many times, we have got for meetings.
So one last extension.
No, we can't, because assembly is there. Assembly से हम क्या करें? Assembly में आगे रख सकते हैं.
Each company has got finance parent, finance legal.
You got the best people.
Chartered accountants. Everybody is working with you people. It's not.
See, what is going to happen? You want to confront this. Your business is going to go out of shape, not ours.
We are humbly requesting you, don't go against this bill. Please support this bill.
We have arranged a working lunch for you all. Please see.
If you don't have, then pay the bill and go.
We have also seen in the past year the kinds of developments, very, very promising and progressive developments that have been taking place. After the passage of the law in Rajasthan, we've had the governments of Telangana and Karnataka announce that they too are now going to come up with legislations dedicated for welfare of social security, welfare of gig workers. Some states are going beyond just mere social security and are providing other essential rights for gig workers as well. And these are developments spreading across political affiliations also. You have governments of Haryana, Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu also announcing and making moves for gig workers. So the Rajasthan law in that sense has opened up the space for progressive states and for other governments to also try and do more.
It started all with Rahul Gandhi ji when he was doing his Padayatra, Bharat Jodo Padayatra. A lot of gig workers, the trade union leaders went and met him. At that time in Karnataka, we didn't have a government. He spoke to Gehlot ji. Rajasthan, we had a government. And Rajasthan has brought a decent sort of a gig worker legislation. Now the new government which has come in, I don't know whether they're taking it forward or not, I'm not aware. So as same model of Rajasthan, we have a little bit enhanced it. We have spent a lot of time. We have called a lot of interested people, the interested parties, taking a lot of legal opinion. Even we had a meeting with ILO also, our secretaries and labor commissioner, they had been to Italy. So a lot of thought process has gone through, a lot of exercise has been done. Now today also we had a stakeholders meeting. Most of them out of 100, mostly 100% people were representing today. And they have given all the opinion. The final touches are that how do we get more revenue to the gig workers platform? One is state government, and second is how we can collect more sort of a fee. Either you call it as a cess, either you call it as a tax, or whether you call it as a fee. So we are looking at on a transaction model or on a turnover model. So I think most probably most of the people, they have given their consent and opinion that it could be on a transaction model. There are companies which are on a similar business. We have told them to give their sort of suggestions also, which they have agreed so far. So most probably in this coming assembly, that I'm hopeful that the new law will be enacted and passed through.
I do come from a trade union background, and labor law has been my special area of interest. I've been teaching labor law for a long period of time. And in the context of gig and platform workers, we decided to do some research into their real life conditions. And so in this very hall, we had a gathering of the food delivery workers. And we sat with them and looked at their handheld devices and tried to understand what are their working hours, how much work do they have to do a particular day, how much distance do they have to cover, what kind of remuneration do they get, are they masters of their time, can they take leave. So we looked at various aspects like this, and we conducted 2 studies before COVID and 1 after COVID. And thereafter, we also did a similar study in Hyderabad among both the food delivery workers and the taxi drivers. And as a result of that insight, those insights which we derived through that research, we decided we must go to the next stage. And since this is a law university and there is enough of legal expertise, we decided to draft the legislation. That motivation came from the hopeless inadequacy of the law that was provided in the Social Security Code, more in order to benefit the aggregators than in order to benefit the workers. So we wanted to lay that bare, and hence we went into drafting this legislation.
The Suchna Evam Rozgar Adhikar Abhiyan has many unions as a part of it. We have gig workers unions that there were 2 or 3 in Rajasthan that are also part of this network. But it's also interesting that in Rajasthan, it was not just the platform-based gig workers who fought for this legislation. This cross-section of an alliance working on unorganized workers. So you had construction workers unions, Narega unions, street vendor unions, domestic workers unions actually came together to fight for the cause of platform-based gig workers. So it was a solidarity of unorganized worker coalitions that came together as SR Abhiyan and fought for this legislation. The Abhiyan has also fought for and won other legislations like the minimum guaranteed income law, which assures Narega and urban employment guarantee across the state, and guaranteed social security pension. And gig worker unions have been a part of that struggle too. So in Rajasthan, there was excellent solidarity between different working class people to fight for these progressive legislations.
I think the fact that the central government has gone slow in relation to gig and platform is because the Social Security Code already had provisions which they thought would be a comprehensive approach to tackle the problem. But as we all know, the 4 labor codes went into deep hibernation, and though they were passed by the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha and the President had given his assent, those laws were never brought into force. Please note that the 4 labor codes are not law now because they have not yet been brought into force. Of course, the legislative process is complete and it can be brought into force at any time.
In Rajasthan, the law got passed by a government which subsequently lost power in elections, and now we are facing a new government which is in charge of implementing the law. We have seen that over the past 3 months, after the implementation of the law, the government has not taken steps to start implementing the law. Rules have not been notified yet. But as a campaign, we are also now preparing and trying to group ourselves and figure out how we can make more workers aware of the legislation and also try to build more public pressure and a public voice for the speedy implementation of this legislation through rules. And we are very positive and we are very sure that a government newly elected will be able to deliver on this mandate.
There are indications now that they would like to bring it into force under the umbrella of, implementing many things during the first 100 days of the new government's innings. So that process is going on now. So while the hibernation was happening at the central government level, state governments became proactive. And Rajasthan was the first to enact. There were other state governments which were also moving in that direction. And so the center has been watching from the sidelines as to what is happening. And most of the activity at the state government level was in states which were governed by the opposition parties. Now that the post-election, that scenario has changed, it's quite likely that other state governments also are about to take interest. But I think it's a matter of time before we hear more about it from the central government also. Now that they are serious about implementing the 4 labor codes, in that context, more serious questions will emerge, and I am of the view that they will begin to address this issue, taking into consideration various developments which have happened after the codes were made known.
So the government of India itself has been having many consultations, conversations, has been reaching out to union representatives, international labor organization aggregators to understand what can be done at a central level. We know that the government of India passed the Code on Social Security in 2020. It was a set of 4 labor laws that were introduced to repeal more than 100 labor legislations that were applicable. The Code on Social Security was introduced in 2020 but has not yet been notified by Government of India, which is what is leaving many workers, particularly platform-based gig workers, in limbo. There are efforts being initiated, but we're seeing that the government of India has been far too slow, and it's actually state governments who've stepped up and done things much quicker and much better than the government of India. We are constantly trying to reach out to government of India to try and see how a minimum base that Rajasthan has been provided can actually be emulated at a national level. We hope that the government of India can do far better and far bigger, but at least not go below what Rajasthan has done, because a precedent has been set. During the G20, there were many conversations around platform-based gig worker social security that the government of India had hosted. You had many international delegations also come, many conversations took place in many fancy locations, but we've seen that there have been articulations of intent, but we have not yet seen something firm and clear, but we really hope that Government of India does something soon.
There is increasing global consensus that it is unfair to deny gig and platform workers what is legitimately due to them. And so we can clearly visualize what is the kind of legislation, what's the kind of policy and rights that the gig and platform workers need. I would begin by making a reference to the ILO Declaration of 1998. It's called the declaration that deals with fundamental principles and rights at work. So under that declaration, there are 5 rights which are recognized. The first one is freedom of association and collective bargaining. The second is no to discrimination. The third is no to forced labor. The fourth is no to child labor. The fifth is to have safe working conditions. So this being part of the declaration, there is an interesting jurisprudence related to that declaration, and that is generally ILO conventions are binding only on those countries which ratify the convention. In respect of each of these standards that I mentioned, the 5 standards, there are 2 ILO conventions on each subject. Many countries may not have ratified them. But when it is an ILO declaration, then every country which is a member of the ILO, India included, India became a member of the ILO, was one of the founding members in the 1920s. So we are bound by that declaration. And the first item on that declaration is freedom of association and collective bargaining. From experience, we know that when you talk of labor law, a major problem is non-implementation of labor law. I may go to the extent of saying the extent of implementation of labor law, especially in India, is directly proportional to the extent of unionization. So unions must be formed, and the gig and platform workers are entitled to form their unions and get into collective bargaining. Then would come the working hours. They cannot be asked to work for indefinite number of hours. There should be a very well laid out working hours with leave and other medical benefits connected with prolonged working. Then the question of wages. There is an impression that these workers are getting very attractive wages. That is because they publicize and do propaganda about the gross wages. From the gross wages, there are many deductions. There is the cost of purchasing a vehicle. They have to repay the banks in installments. There is maintenance cost. There is the cost of fuel. There is the cost of unexpected breakdowns. So there are, if you take into consideration all these costs, including their handheld devices, then the actual wage they get, we found from our studies, is after 12 hours of work, they are hardly getting the equivalent of a minimum wage. And we are of the opinion that for 8 hours of work, they should get nothing less than the minimum wage which exists for a semi-skilled worker. Because these are all not unskilled people. They are handling the handheld device, and all their work instructions are received through this handheld device and through the algorithms. Therefore, that wage part must be protected. The third important thing is social security. Social security is well protected in India under the Employees Provident Fund Act and the Employees State Insurance Act. ILO Convention 102 elaborates 9 types of social security which are worldwide recognized. Interestingly, if you look at the EPF Act and the ESI Act, all 9 are covered. Sadly, that is available only to the organized sector. So these EPF and ESI Acts will have to be suitably modified in order to be made applicable to a gig and platform. You don't even need any major modification, because if there are more than 10 or more than 20 workers, then these laws apply. And therefore, I would plead that even as of now, these laws apply. And if those laws are applied, then that takes care of social security. I would put social welfare in another category. And that is, you might provide some benefit for children's education, you might provide some scholarships, you might provide a housing loan facility. That can be covered under welfare schemes, as they used to do in the BD Welfare Board and as they have been doing with the construction workers. So there's a similar provision here, but that is not a substitute for serious social security protection as recognized by the ILO. I would also think that you must take care of their occupational diseases. What is the kind of diseases, injuries that they suffer? Injuries at work. They are forced to race through crowded streets in order to deliver within the time limit that is prescribed by the algorithm. And they run into accidents, and that is largely ignored. So if the ESI Act applies, then accidents which are described as arising out of and in the course of employment will be covered. Even if there's no ESI, the Workmen's Compensation Act would cover it. And so there are, in that sense, many standard laws which are described by the ILO as co-labor standards and minimum conditions for decent work norms to be observed. They have to be built into this legislation. I'm sorry to say that the existing type of legislation that we have been talking about covers hardly 10% of those needs. And the ILO, as well as the European Union, is already recognizing those as minimum standards which must be observed.
In an ideal scenario, we would like there to be legislation for platform-based gig workers across the country. It should not be just left to the will and intent of different state governments, because while some might have the intent, some might not. So we do need to set a minimum, a threshold at a national level. It should be a legislation and not a policy or a scheme, because we know that legislations allow workers to mobilize and keep fighting for it. And it's also something that can't be just done away with just because political regimes change. They are putting in so much hard work and so much labor that they be compensated fairly, not just a minimum wage, but they have a decent wage, that they have rights to social security, so that when they're able-bodied and working, they are able to generate a dignified income through their work. But when they're not able-bodied, when they are weak, when they're ill, when they're incapacitated because of other reasons, that there is a sensitive social security framework that can look after them. The law should also ensure that their health is protected while they go about doing their work. And this is something we have seen, their exposure to levels of pollution, their exposure to heat, cold, is something that really requires an urgent intervention. And with growing climate change, we really have to ensure that platform-based gig workers are protected against.
Gig workers, they consume a lot of carbon dioxide. It's not easy. virtually, I don't know how long will they last doing this business. My heart and sympathies goes to them, even though they make some maybe a decent money, but at a larger point of time, and if you see, if they are doing the same business for a decade or two, definitely there's a lot of health factor which we need to look into. That's what I was talking to all the stakeholders. When they come, they talk more about rules, regulations, legislation, how it has to be made. But I always feel that this business has to be looked into a larger perspective. The reason is, person who's on a road for 15 hours, 16 hours, 12 hours a day, definitely his lifespan is going to be shortened, which has to be considered for every government, immaterial of state or whichever government is ruling. In this connection, I feel we should have more sort of a fund for them to give a better health conditions to them.
राजस्थान में गिग वर्कर्स के लिए पहला कानून बना है, तो हम वहाँ की सरकार को तो धन्यवाद दें, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है कि वो कानून बन गया तो मतलब वो बहुत एक पहली शुरुआत है और एक रास्ता खोलता है वो कानून, और उसके लिए भी संघर्ष जारी है।
Roj kuan khodo, roj pani piyo, right? It's like you dig the well every day and you pull the water out and you drink the water. Everybody who's a worker, whether it's that same independent contractor who, let's say, is a video editor, or a independent contractor who's a script writer, independent contractor who's a lyricist, independent contractor who is a paralegal working for multiple lawyers. All of them know why they are that, why they accumulated those skills. They accumulated those skills to have a better life. What they have to cut through is the last 20, 30 years of consciousness that's been built, wherein you think all that exists in this world is individuals. And, one individual's primary role is to compete and cut the other individual's throat. If you accept that world, you'll be the last person to change. But if you are a person has any degree of discomfort with that definition of the world, then you will begin to recognize these stories and you'll begin to shift.
आते हैं और आते हैं कंपनी वाले आते हैं कंपनी वाले आते हैं अरे ओला यूबर आते हैं स्विगी जोमेटो आते हैं ओला ऊबर आते हैं स्विगी जोमेटो आते हैं ये आते हैं अमेज़न फ्लिपकार्ट आते हैं अमेज़न फ्लिपकार्ट चुपके आते हैं खुल कर कमाते हैं चुपके आते हैं खुले में कमाते हैं चुपके आते हैं खूब ये कमाते हैं चुपके आते हैं खूब ये कमाते हैं पहले थोड़ा लालच देते लोगों को फंसाते हैं करोड़ों का खर्च करके धंधा ये जमाते हैं एक बार जम गए तो भारी लूट मचाते हैं अरे आते हैं एग्रीगेटर आते हैं न गाड़ी है न ड्राइवर है कमाई इनकी भारी है न फैक्ट्री है न माल बनाते फिर भी बिक्री भारी है न फैक्ट्री है न माल बनाते फिर भी बिक्री भारी है